or maybe it's not.
It looks like we're live.
Yeah, it says we're live, but the song isn't playing because that happens sometimes.
My happy dance.
Gosh darn it, Ecamm! Can't you just get your shit together one time? Hello. Sorry about that. I will yell at the computer programming later. Anyone out there listening, thank you so much for joining us. My name is Claire Martin, and I'm the Assistant Artistic Director of Sweet Tea Shakespeare, and I'm joined here today by Jeremy Fabig, the Artistic Director, and a new friend of ours, Will Bartley, the Artistic Director of Cup of Hemlock, a theater company based in Toronto, Canada. Will, thank you so much for joining us today. It's great to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be part of the conversation.
So today we are taking a deep dive into Shakespeare's pastoral comedy, As You Like It. Will and I have been kind of in each other's orbits for a few months now. We met doing a drunk Shakespeare game, which is like how all the best friendships start. And then from there, we just sort of continued to stay in touch. I've appeared as a guest on Cup of Hemlock's podcasts in the past. And recently, we each submitted 7 actors to a full cast Zoom reading of As You Like It. We used an adaptation that I had done, and that will be dropping as a podcast sometime soon. Will read for Jacques, the melancholic, sardonic forest dweller with the Duke. I was supposed to read stage directions and ended up reading for Audrey, which was hilarious. And today we're just gonna dive into the play because it is an absolute goldmine and deservedly one of Shakespeare's most beloved comedies. So the first thing I'd love to ask for both of you guys is like, what is your experience, past and present, with As You Like It, and what draws you to the play?
Well, I suppose I can jump on that one first. In truth, like I've read this play so many times. It's one of my favorites when I look back on the entire canon for Shakespeare. My unfortunate side of it is that I've never actually been able to be a part of a production, and the most experience I have with it is taking a lot of soliloquies and monologues from it and refining it as an actor as well. So I was very excited to get through one full reading of it and then to also play my favorite character, Jacques, just from the entire canon. Like, he is just so funny and cynical and facetious all the time, and so being able to bring that to light into the reading was a lot of fun for me. So I'm hoping that moving forward in the future, at some point, I'll have a chance to maybe direct the play or act in it in some capacity. Mm-hmm.
And you've written a play based on it.
That is very true. Yeah, I'm currently developing a play that is based on the 7 Ages of Man speech, All the World's a Stage, where basically using the 7 ages that Jacques breaks down in terms of what our roles are in life. I represent 7 different archetypes of Shakespeare's characters on the stage as Jacques kind of moves through them, and in a very I guess in a very Jacques way, killing off these archetypes as a way to rediscover his own identity, which I believe is a big struggle of the character through the play of As You Like It as well. So yeah.
Awesome. Jeremy, you have a storied history with this play.
Oh my gosh. So I think my history with this play began with production. I was assistant director and stage manager for the American Shakespeare Center in 2006. And I heard that play many dozens of times as a part of that process. And then since coming to Fayetteville, I directed it at the Gilbert Theater and played the Dukes in that production. Sweet Tea Shakespeare has done it sort of 1.5 times, sort of. We did a Renaissance style production with some friends of ours at the Blackfriars Conference a few years ago, and then right after that we did a full production that I co-directed, and then I directed it last summer at Hoosier Shakes in Indiana.
Oh, nice.
So and I was in it once. I did play Jacques. The summer after my first year of teaching, I went to Pigeon Creek Shakes in Michigan and played Jacques there.
Was it fun?
It was fun. I love that character. I think he's a brilliant asshole, and I just love it.
Mm-hmm.
If I could ask you, I mean, Jake has some of the best speeches in all of the canon, and he has so many of them in this play. Which was your favorite while you were playing the character?
My favorite to play is one of the ones where he's describing Touchstone, and kind of having the conversation with Touchstone at the same time. And there's just a great, like, it's almost like a patter song of verse right there, and I just love it. It was fun to do.
I think it is one of the best Shakespeare entrances, when he comes in and just immediately starts with a fool, I met a fool in the forest. Like, it doesn't get much more, like, delightful or I don't know, like, buoyant than that. Those like the triple exclamation marks and just the repetition of that word. Yeah, it's that's a really sort of jazzy entrance. It's one of my favorite walk-ins. Yeah.
Well, I find it too, like, well, I'm sure we'll get into it during the conversation here, but I find it so interesting too that one of the only characters Jake seems to take joy in and excitement in is Touchstone.
Yep.
Like, he is so excited to talk about Touchstone and his entire involvement in the plot itself. And then we have other characters who play music, but he's very demanding and cynical towards them. So yeah, it was nice to see that other side of Jake coming through with the presence of Touchstone in the play. So
awesome. Well, the first thing we want to do, just like with Love's Labor's Lost, I'm going to do just a brief rundown of the plot so that we know what's going on in this funky play. If there are any holes or issues as they come up, please correct me. Basically, this play is a sparkling romantic comedy that starts in completely the opposite vein. So we open at the court of Duke Frederick, who is actually a usurper. So he is the younger brother of the sort of authentic, legitimate Duke, who he has foisted out and sort of taken over control of his kingdom. And so Duke Frederick has a daughter named Celia, and Duke Senior, his elder brother, who he's banished, also has a daughter named Rosalind. And Rosalind is living in the court with Duke Frederick and Celia because the cousins, Celia and Roz, are like the best of friends and eternally loyal to each other. And so Frederick has allowed his niece to reside with him, even though she is the daughter of the brother that he chased off the throne. We also have more sort of family drama. We have these two brothers, Oliver, the elder, and Orlando Dubois. They are the sons of a nobleman who is now deceased, who was loyal to Duke Senior, Rosalind's banished father. Oliver is quite haughty and sort of insanely jealous of his younger brother, and so for reasons that he mostly keeps to himself, he has sort of cut Orlando's inheritance off. So Orlando's not getting any of the money that he was like promised by his father, and he hasn't gotten any of the education or privilege that should come along with his rank. And so there's tension between the brothers. The very, very first scene of the play features them getting into a literal fist fight. So there's family tensions amok in this court. The first kind of major plot point we have is that Orlando decides that he is going to challenge Charles the Wrestler, who's this like gargantuan behemoth man who wrestles for the pleasure of the court, like it's a sport that they can all watch. Orlando decides to wrestle him, and Oliver thinks this is great because the likelihood that his weakling brother will get absolutely snapped in half is very high, so he's all for this. Rosalind and Celia, meanwhile, along with a fool in the court named Touchstone, they decide that they're going to watch the wrestling match. They try to dissuade Orlando from it. They can't. He's pretty dead set. He's got a bit of a suicidal thing going. Orlando and Rosalind have a meet cute and fall instantly, if not in love, then they're just instantly smitten with each other, to the point that Orlando is literally struck dumb and can't talk. Amazingly, Orlando wins the wrestling match. When we did the reading, we had a lot of theories as to how, but Orlando wins, and Rosalind gives him a necklace from around her neck to wear, in the old sort of iconic tradition of the lovers exchanging favors. And no sooner has this kind of fledgling romance begun than Duke Frederick decides that it has gotten too dangerous having the beautiful, witty, self-possessed Rosalind at the court as a reminder to everyone of the injustice that he has done to her father. So Duke Frederick banishes Rosalind, says, get out of my kingdom, get out of my castle. And Celia decides to go with her. She says, if you're banished, then I am too. Screw my dad. Let's run away into the forest together. They decide to run into the forest of Arden, which is where Duke Senior, Rosalind's father, has been hiding out with a bunch of lords, including Jacques. And for their own safety, the girls decide that Rosalind will disguise herself as a boy and go by the name Ganymede, and Celia will pose as a peasant named Aliena, his sister. And so in that way, they can be tied together, but they sort of have this additional safety net of the appearance of a man traveling with them. They also decide to bring Touchstone, because if you're going on a road trip, you want the one that's going to crack all the jokes. So they all run into the Forest of Arden. Meanwhile, Oliver decides that is a pretty good idea to his own brother, so he tells Orlando. He first tries to set him on fire. God, this is a weird play. He decides he's going to maybe set the house on fire where Orlando lives. Orlando escapes that, and along with their manservant Adam, who served their father when he was alive, Adam and Orlando also run into the Forest of Arden to flee Oliver's wrath. So we have all of our quote-unquote good characters running into the forest. And we have our leading heroine in cross-dress. So then the whole tenor of the play shifts as the location of the play shifts from this very cold, autocratic, male-dominated court into this sort of pastoral fairy tale of a forest, the Forest of Arden, where we meet Duke Senior, Rosalind's father, and his merry men, basically, some of whom are lords that sort of followed him into banishment. Jacques is the Duke's companion and is kind of what Touchstone is for the girls. Jacques provides amusement and sort of sardonic commentary on the world around them. He's much more melancholy and much more cynical than Touchstone, but the friendship and camaraderie and humor that he provides for the Duke is similar to what Touchstone is offering to the girls. And so then, sort of from then on, we're much more in a traditional romantic comedy. Orlando connects with Duke Senior and sort of finds his way to the enclave. And once he's settled, he starts writing love poems to Rosalind and pinning it up on trees. Rosalind and Celia and Touchstone find some of these poems and read them, and they are horrendous. And Celia and Touchstone give Rosalind so much crap for how head over heels her boy is in love. And then Rosalind meets Orlando, and of course she is dressed as a boy, and she decides to have some fun with him and also to test his love. And so she approaches him as Ganymede. She does not reveal her true identity. And she tells Orlando that if he is truly in love, she can cure him of his love sickness. All he has to do is visit her every day and call her. Pronouns are really hard when talking about this play. Woo Ganymede, basically, by calling Ganymede Rosalind. And so this double role play sort of emerges. That becomes a long extension of a sort of a wooing scene in reverse, in which Rosalind as Ganymede, as Rosalind, basically puts Orlando through his paces to sort of puncture his more idealistic notions of love and introduce him to the full miracle and madness of loving a woman. Meanwhile, there are shepherds and shepherdesses that are running amok, and so we have a poor besotted shepherd named Silvius chasing this really sort of hot, sassy wench named Phoebe, who could not be more disdainful to him, could not be less interested, and they have some really fun back and forth. Phoebe and Silvius run into Rosalind dressed as Ganymede. In a true kind of Twelfth Night fashion, Phoebe falls in love with Ganymede, not realizing it's a woman, and so we have a love triangle that emerges. I mean, it's really more like a love rectangle, but Silvius and Phoebe don't know about Orlando. And meanwhile, Touchstone has he's got the hots for this hot shepherdess named Audrey. And so all of these love stories begin emerging. At one point, we have Oliver come into the forest, and Oliver's had a change of heart, and he meets Celia, and they fall in love at first sight. So by the time we get to the end of this play, Rosalind is in a position where she has to sort of reveal herself as a her, and also reveal that she has been sort of responsible for so many of the relationships that have developed in the woods. And we get this sort of remarkable final scene in which she and Celia go off together, and then they come back on, and Rosalind is now dressed as a woman, and Duke Sr. and Orlando are like, oh my gosh! And so she reunites with her father, and she promises to marry Orlando. Phoebe promises to marry Silvius because she can no longer be with Ganymede, because Ganymede isn't real. And then we have this double Deus Ex Machina, where Hymen, the literal god of marriage, arrives and like makes, these, like, just sings a song about how marriage is wonderful, and he's going to sort of conjure all these marriages. And then we also have Jacques Dubois, the middle brother of Orlando and Oliver, who's been away at school. He arrives and says, Duke Frederick has met a religious man and had a change of heart. He has decided to, like, leave his pretensions to the throne. Like, Duke Sr., you can go back to court now. You can be back in charge. All of the sort of social instability has been rectified, and everything is put back in order. And we end with that sort of those 4 marriages and that promise of the Duke Sr. re-attaining the throne. And Jacques tells him, I'm going to join Duke Frederick in exile and do the sort of monastic life. And then everybody dances because it's comedy. So yeah, it's, for a Shakespearean comedy, it is fairly light and cheery. The beginning, the first act is not, and I think Jacques' departure at the very end is our one melancholy note that we end on. But it is, it's about as jubilant an ending as you can get. It's got, I don't know if there's a Shakespeare play with more marriages at the end than As You Like It. I think 4 is, people watching, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is like the most 8 people getting married at once, I think, is a record for Shakespeare.
It's a lot.
Yeah, that's our play.
I think Merchant is the next one with 3 marriages at the end, right?
Mm-hmm.
Something like that.
We did it. We got through it all. Hooray. That's quite a plot.
It's a hard one to distill. Like, I tried, but there's too many people and they do too many weird things for me to condense it anymore. So, sorry about that. You had to listen to me rant for a while.
It's okay, but I think it unpacks the actually the complexity of the plot. Unlocks some of what I think we're supposed to understand about this play, which is almost that it's not about the plot at all. And so I'm sure we'll dig into that as well.
Well, and we talked about when we did Love's Labours how the plot for that play could not be thinner. Basically, we need the boys to make this resolution not to fall in love, and then we need 4 girls. And other than that, everything that happens is just kind of wordplay. Whereas in this play, so much happens. Like, even though it's not like there's a billion locations, there really are only 2, but like the what is happening in those relationships, and like as motivations are changing and as characters are pursuing goals, like there is just a lot of stuff going on.
Yeah. So what are we talking about now?
Well, I'd love to hear about the historical context in which Shakespeare was writing As You Like It, like the point where he was at in his career and kind of where this play is situated in his own body of work.
Yeah, so I'm happy to jump on part of this. The most recent argument about the historical context of this particular play, or the most highest profile, most recent, is from James Shapiro's book 1599, in which his argument is that this play is being written around the same time as Hamlet and a few other things that he's working on, that's his part of his argument is that As You Like It and Hamlet are being written sort of with the same issues in mind. That As You Like It is in many respects the anti-Hamlet. So whereas Hamlet is this, but they have the same kind of DNA. Hamlet is this, verbose, moody, a sort of guy who thinks about his inner world, and Rosalind is his opposite,
Yeah.
an extroverted, still wordy, but not driven by mood, is concerned with the external world in opposition to Hamlet's inner world, and so you see like this idea that Shakespeare might have been flexing his muscles in one way with Hamlet, and then stretching them in the opposite direction with As You Like It. I do think like so this play is it's based on a novel. So Shakespeare would have been reading the As You Like It story. He makes several changes. He keeps the plot, but makes several changes to the character. And it's based, or it comes out of a tradition, or speaks to a tradition that began with Arcadia in the early 1580s, which is a Philip Sidney poetic work that sort of launched a vogue in sort of this idealistic exterior of foreign life and world, and the values that it had, standing in opposition to the sort of cramped urban legalistic world of the city. And so it was so influential and so popular that, Shakespeare sort of sticks his hands in it many times over the course of his career, but really tackles it head on in this piece. And I think in terms of just a general context here, one of the things I always look for when a play like As You Like It comes along, which has an abundance of meaty female characters, is that year, that time, Shakespeare had at his beck a lot of young boys from the local playing companies who were available and adept at doing what they needed to do. And there's some really great, Rosalind, of course, Celia, and Phoebe are three of these just sort of precocious characters that sort of signify that don't get written a couple years earlier or a couple years later, but because Shakespeare's got these boys and needs to give them something to do, a play like As You Like It happens. So I mean, like that's like the tiniest nutshell possible, I suppose. But this is not the only play where Shakespeare is playing around with this. He does do it in Love's Labour's Lost to some degree. It does, As You Like It, also has a kind of a fairy tale quality to it, an evil duke, and to this sort of rescue operation that kind of happens, and a restoration at the end that reminds us, I think, of All's Well That Ends Well, something like that, and even to Merchant, in the way that Merchant has this sort of idealistic place that it ends in Belmont, where everything is restored. And in Merchant, it's a real problem. Don't get me wrong, but I think there's a kind of common DNA from As You Like It to those plays that are doing that type of thing. Same thing with Midsummer, where there is an ideal world where realization and self-realization and coupling takes place in that other place. And I think for me, As You Like It is that play about, is the play, if it's about nothing else, it's about that coupling and what that coupling means, sort of at a sort of cartoon, superficial, theatrical level with some of these characters, and then at a real human level with some of these other characters like Rosalind and Orlando, and Rosalind and Celia.
I also love the idea of this play as an anti-Hamlet, and Rosalind and Hamlet specifically being antithetical to each other, because Hamlet spends his whole play dithering about whether to do and what to do. Rosalind just does over and over again. She is the actor manager of this play. Everything she even says to us, the audience, she says, I'm going to be an actor on this stage. And when she is going to see Sylvius and Phoebe, she like inserts herself into the middle of their drama and tries to tell each of them what to do. So it's not just in her relationship with Orlando that she sort of exhibits this assertiveness and sort of fearless action that sort of few women do in these early modern plays, but it's not just with her lover. It's with all of the characters. And when she has her impeccable, sort of one of her final speeches to Orlando, where she says, I can do strange things. To me, that's her way of retroactively bragging about the fact that she has been orchestrating so much of what actually happens in the play. It's her, she's banished, and so she is forced out of the castle, but every decision she makes after they leave, it stems from her own desire and her own impulses, including the decision to dress as a boy. And so that's very empowering for me as a female identifying performer, because if we think of Roz and Hamlet as being two of Shakespeare's greatest creations, the fact that the character who boldly ventures forth and takes action is the female, and that the character who gets stuck in his own head and doesn't know what to do and struggles to take action is a boy, like that is that's very affirming for me. And that also is a really, to me, like, that's a really truthful way of approaching character. It seems like Shakespeare was not hemmed in by the need to appease certain gender roles. He just wrote what felt true. And a woman like Rosalind saying, if you try to stop a woman's wit, it's going to find cracks. It's going to find a way out, because women just are, like, women's intelligence is irrepressible. For her to say something like that, to me, that, like, I don't know, it's just, it doesn't get much better.
I find it too interesting bringing up the point of Hamlet being the antithesis to this play in a lot of ways, because there's very similar character dynamics in both the plays as well, in terms of like the characters that associate themselves with each other. I mean, the wit and creativity and wordplay and banter that exists between Rosalind and Celia, you can really catch that a lot with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, and then you have Jacques representing this very internalized, thoughtful character. Obviously, Hamlet's within that as well. And there are a lot of comparisons. You can take Orlando and Oliver and kind of find comparisons to Horatio as well, but then also the whole theme and dynamic of two brothers at play for dominance and rulership of a certain area, and then obviously in Hamlet that's been resolved by the start of the play, and in this one it's currently in debate. So I just find it interesting that the character dynamics also exist, just in slightly different variants of these characters as well. So,
and one of the things we talked about in our post-show discussion, I don't know if you were here for this part, Will, because Will had to duck out early, but we talked about how the fact that women have an extraordinary amount of agency in this play, like an unprecedented amount of agency in this play for an early modern play, it is part of what contributes to its comedic, by which I mean happy, ending. The fact that women take charge and that women make decisions is part of why things end well. I mean, Orlando is a darling, but he is a train wreck of a human being, and the fullest expression of his love that he can fathom is writing his poetry and pinning it on trees. But like, he can't, when he's confronted with the woman he loves, he can't even speak to her. He's so nervous. And so if Rosalind didn't sort of approach him as Ganymede, dare him to be sort of to join her in this extended role play, if she didn't probe him and like prick him into doing it, they may never have had a romantic conclusion. They may never have found their way to marriage, because Orlando doesn't seem to have the personality of a man who could even ask a girl on a date, let alone ask her to marry him. And so, similarly to Juliet at the balcony scene, who's like, so are we doing this? Are we getting married? I feel like Rosalind has a similar, in the final scene, she's like, don't worry, like, you're going to get to marry her. But Orlando is then spared from having to actually pop the question. And so, in my adaptation, I regendered some of the characters in order to like reify that idea even more, that it's when women are in control and when women have some agency, that the ending has the potential to be happier, and that reconciliation and reunions and forgiveness becomes more possible. And I think that in that way, Jeremy, what you were saying about, the restoration at the end and how it mirrors some of these other plays, I actually feel like this play has a lot in common with Cymbeline. I think in many ways, those two are connected. It's not just the fairy tale ethos of the story, but it's also the fact that, like all of the other kind of romances, but I think especially with Cymbeline, it is the agency of the female heroine that enables and engenders an ending that is sort of like hopeful and affirmational. It's if Imogen didn't take action as often and as sort of fully and wholeheartedly as she does, then the kingdom might have been lost, and she and Posthumus may never have found their way back to each other.
Yeah, I think you're right. I also think that this play is playing with the idea of what kinds of couples do we want, and sort of what ending do they bring, and sort of what and this sort of idealization of the heteronormative coupling as the ideal here. I mean, part of what this play is doing is exploring the sort of detachment between sibling type love or bedfellow type love between, say, Celia and Rosalind, and really stretching that apart and looking at the detachment there, and then sort of exchanging that first attachment with a new one. And there are some great exceptions. I mean, and those are the people that get married at the end, right? But the great thing is that there are other things going on here. So it's not just about that coupling, but it's also about the detachment and reattachment of brothers, the Dukes and Oliver and Orlando and Jacques Dubois, and it's looking at that. It's looking at the detachment and reattachment in a different way of Rosalind and Celia. So it's looking at all kinds of couplings, and exploring more or less where are the right fits. And there are some people in the play who do have the right fit, who make the right fit, and then there are some people in the play who don't have a fit at all by the end. People like Senior and people like Jacques, who are there and there is not a partner for them.
Except Touchstone.
I think
I would argue Touchstone is potentially that person.
Well, I think Touchstone would disagree, but Jacques may not.
Sure.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think for Jacques or Jacques, his job is his sort of character drive is to sort of push people away. And so it's hard for him to have a partner. I think there's an interesting queer reading on that character that can be pretty compelling, and that accounts for his sort of lack of a partner at the end. But I think that's, as a general rule, I think that coupling and uncoupling is part of what the play is exploring, if it's exploring anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I find it interesting too, the characters who are left without a pairing on the stage, because unlike other plays, I mean, when I look at the ending of Merchant and I look at Antonio, who is left without a pairing when almost everybody else is paired off in some form or fashion, and Shylock as well, there's a very tragic element that could be played at the end of that. In this play, it doesn't feel like it though. Like Duke Senior ends up in the position that he wanted in the first place. Jacques actively makes the decision to go off and pursue a life that he feels is worthwhile. And I think that the ending of these different characters is quite representative. Perhaps maybe one of the things Shakespeare is trying to suggest to the audience is, what does satisfaction in life look like? What does happiness look like? What are the different forms that it takes place in for every individual? Again, we have a lot of characters in other plays from the canon that end alone and end sadly. But Jacques, has been sardonic and cynical and jaded, as we've talked about throughout the course of this conversation so far. But he doesn't seem too resentful or upset about the idea of going back to live in the forest. Like, what is his draw towards that kind of like nomadic, simpler life? Like I think there's a lot of commentary around the idea of like living in nobility or living like urban style lives or versus the kind of country or more simple life, quote unquote, if that's a fair thing to say. And I think Jacques maybe has found some solace or some peace in that is worth exploring too.
Yeah, there's definitely an idealization of the pastoral life, like for sure,
Mm-hmm.
because there is a resounding freedom that Rosalind and Celia in particular find in the forest. They're without the oppressive sort of strictures of court, without the seamstress listening to them, without the looming father, another thing from Hamlet, right? The evil uncles got straight out of Hamlet. But in the forest and in sort of male attire, the combination of those, or I should say the intersection of that cross-dressing and that liminal pastoral space, where the social protocols no longer apply quite so much. Rosalind has the freedom to like fully inhabit her agency. And so she can do strange things because she is allowed to, or rather not allowed to, or maybe there's no system in place to curb her in all of the ways that there would be back in court. What's so interesting to me is that Orlando has that freedom as well. I mean, he's a man, so even denied so much of his inheritance by his brother Oliver, even at court, he always did have his male privilege. But like, he goes into the forest, and we get a true sense of who he is, and who he is just a absolutely endearing romantic, like a very kind of open-hearted, open-minded, kind of insecure and gawky guy. And he just is allowed to like live in that sort of that state, that right-brained, floofy state. And he, even when he goes up against Jacques, who, sort of is trying to puncture that personality, Orlando stands firm, and has really wonderful sort of pithy responses, but he refuses to let Jacques shame him for having qualities that may, in the masculine world of the court, seem effeminate.
Yeah, I think that's true. I also think there's like, to understand what's going on with some of these characters and their coupling or their sort of conscious detachment from that world, we have to sort of talk about what the Elizabethan and Jacobean sort of take on sexuality and friendship is. Mm-hmm. Which is part, and like that's when people talk about this play, part of what they talk about is that, and sometimes Jacques comes up, but definitely Rosalind and Celia's relationship comes up, and Ganymede and Orlando's relationship comes up, because all of those things on some level feel queer to us in the modern world. Mm-hmm. On some level, and the best and simplest way I can describe this, although there is much delicious scholarly work on this, the best way I can describe it is that same-sex relationships, which are cousins, brothers, sisters, cousins, best friends, have the intimacy in them that we today mostly ascribe to like marriage or cohabitation or cohabitating couples. That's the center of intimacy, not necessarily, I should say, like heterosexual married couple, where those relationships are sort of getting meted out in sort of contractual arrangements between families.
Right.
So it's your intimacy, your close, vulnerable, personal relationship is happening with that other person of the same sex. And it's intimate basically on every level. Those people are sleeping together, sometimes in all senses of that word, and sometimes they're just like sharing the same bed.
Yeah.
So it's the best way I can describe it is that it's as intimate as lovers, but it doesn't require them to be lovers.
Yeah.
but sometimes they're lovers anyway. That makes sense.
Yeah.
And that's part of what I think this play is calling our attention to, is to look at that kind of intimacy and how it's had, how it can be manufactured, who has it sort of authentically, and all of that sort of thing. Yeah. And so thank you for listening to my monologue. But also I just want to say that I think some of the play is about words and literacy versus its opposite. And so Rosalind is a person who has literacy, and it's working up here. And Orlando is a person who doesn't have those words, who doesn't have literacy, and it's all coming from the heart.
Yep.
And about how they unlock each other in a certain way.
Yeah.
They have the key to each other, right? Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, she melts around Orlando. Even as she goes galloping around with her words, she absolutely is enamored with him. And I think it's because he is just so... there's like an open valve on his heart.
Mm-hmm.
I think speaking of like the heart and Orlando's expression of love and all these characters' relationship to love, I think the one thing that this play does so beautifully is an exploration of the different meanings of love. And I always go to like the Greek definitions of love because they had all these different variants of the word, agape, eros, philia, storge, and I always struggle over these last two, xenia and philotia. But it's amazing to watch all these characters come to life on the stage and these different explorations. Like obviously the like love of religion or love of worship type of dynamics, but then specifically the one that I find is highlighted the most in this play is eros, a love of equals, a love of friendship, camaraderie. We see that between Celia and Rosalind. We see that between Orlando and a lot of the other male characters on the stage, and obviously like Touchstone, Jacques as well. And then the love of knowledge, the love of study. I mean, we really capture that through Jacques as well. And then obviously also with all the parent dynamics that are taking place on the stage, and then the allegiances that come from the children in terms of their parentage and kind of how they shift and go back and forth. And as you talked about earlier, Jeremy, like this reunification of these characters coming back together, like these families being reunited, like Sorga as well. And so it's I don't find that it's very often that we get such full capturing ideologies of love in one singular play. And I think that's what one of the greatest strengths of this play is in particular.
Yeah. So Will, I'd love to hear you talk about Jacques. Why him? Why do you love him? Why, like, what connects you to him? And also, I want to make sure we just touch on the 7 Ages of Man speech, because you were an absolute pro on the day of. You read the speech, even with my amendment. And I'd love to talk about it. And I'd just love to dive into that character. So, fourth.
Sure. It's not a problem. Yeah. I mean, I've always felt quite a natural affinity to these characters that are very much caught in their heads, possibly because I am similar in those ways. But at the end of the day, I find that Shakespeare uses these characters as a conduit to speak directly to the audience in a very advisory type of role, it seems. I mean, we see with Hamlet, too, when he's talking about the actor's speech, for instance, speak the speech, I pray you, and do so trippingly on the tongue. There are so many of these characters that are in their heads throughout the course of the entire play that speak directly to the audience, give advice to the audience, like help to try and course out maybe the message of the piece or the ideas that exist within the piece. Beyond that, too, I mean, like as you talked about, Claire, like the sardonic nature of the character, the jaded cynicism of him. I just love the wit that he brings into each moment that he's a part of. And then his dynamic with Orlando, too, is absolutely hilarious. Like just this constant back and forth of like, all right, lover boy, well, enjoyed being up in the clouds. Like, I'm going to be back down here on Earth. And Orlando just being like, all right, man, whatever. I don't really care. And so Jacques being caught up so much in the like ideals of life that he kind of misses the meaning of life in the first place. And I find that that's maybe a motivator for his decision to return to that pastoral life in a way, to try and figure it out more. And I find that he is just one of those he's one of those characters in the canon that just doesn't have his story resolved by the end of the play. And I always find those characters in themselves to be fascinating because usually there's this nice pretty bow wrapped up on a lot of the different characters by the end of each play. And then I just find it so...
Or not so pretty. The bow doesn't have
or not
pretty.
so pretty.
The bow can be that you got killed.
Yeah, for sure. But it's all to say is that just there's usually some sort of finalization on character dynamics. So I find myself absolutely captivated by characters who don't get a resolution. And Jake is one of them. And then we talked a little bit about Merchant, and Antonio is one of them. And Shylock, in a way, is one of them, I believe. Like, I don't believe Shylock just walks off that stage and that story is resolved. Like Horatio, I find, is one of them as well, like talking about Hamlet earlier. And I think that there is something within these characters. Like there was something that was taught to me back in university that kind of stuck with me. And it was the philosophy that it's the last character on stage, or the last character that's alive, or the last character whose story is unresolved, that is the actual focus of the piece. And so I find myself very...
Just saying.
Yeah, right. Like, and I think there is something to that. I don't think it's necessarily always correct, but I do think that there is some attention that should be drawn to these very complicated characters who really, and they tend to be the philosophical characters, the ones that are very much caught up in the meaning of things, the story that's just unfolded, the experience of the main characters throughout the piece, right? I mean, at the end of each play, the protagonists are almost always resolved, whether they die, whether they marry, whether they are satisfied, they get what they wanted from the beginning. Whatever the role may be, the protagonists are always the one that are wrapped up, but then these side characters are left to wonder what their role is. And I think that is a good segue into the 7 Ages of Man, All the World's a Stage speech right there. So actually, I kind of wanted to pick your brains first. What do you think of this speech, if that's okay for me to ask?
Go for it, Jeremy.
Okay. So I have mixed feelings about this speech. I should say I've used it a lot. Like I use it in like devised theater courses and things like that to do work with students, because I think it's sort of universality helps. There's a hook for everybody in it, and that's of course by design. The parts of it that I don't like are that it feels like a set piece. It feels like Shakespeare actually had a good idea for a 7 Ages of Man speech at some other time.
That's to be or not to be. That's how I feel about that speech too.
I was just about to bring that up.
Well, and both may be true. But like on a Tuesday afternoon, he was struck by the muse, and he wrote.
I gotta write this down.
And was looking for a play to write around it.
Sure.
And that's the part that I don't like. I don't know that that's not entirely the fault of the play as much as it is how we as a culture sort of elevated this speech to ornamental position, and the way we have made it. I also do think that the play actually has lots of these things in it, that it allows for and is about these sort of set pieces to be dropped in. I mean, another example earlier, I don't know if it was earlier or later, like the drop-ins of the sonnets
later
that Orlando has written, and then later the drop-ins of the songs that by the pages and other things, and then of course the drop-in at the end from Hyman is all about sort of like. It's it's like Love's Labor's Lost in this way too, where there is it's about language and form in those spots, and then the everything else is kind of an on-ramp or an exit ramp to that piece, which is a lot of me talking about the stuff around the piece and not the piece. But the great thing about this piece, and the reason I think it does get lifted up, is that it's one of those things that is university relevant and contains within it like total truth. And those are things I think to love about it for sure.
Mm-hmm. And in a few seconds, I definitely want to go chunk by chunk through this speech and kind of break down a lot of the elements of it. But Claire, if I could hear your input on it as well before we jump into that part there.
I owe many of my thoughts about this speech to the once and future Rosa Josie, the director theater director and also the artistic director of Upstart Crow Collective, an all-women and non-binary theater company based out of Seattle. She directed As You Like It at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival last year, and actually cut this speech from the scene in which it appears. And because I totally agree with you, Jeremy, it does not seem to fit the tenor of the story or really the plot at all at the point that it falls. And she actually used it as the epilogue. So after the big marriage and dance, she brought her 7 female identifying actors together. And they each took one of the 7 ages. And then all of her male identifying and non-binary, I think just male identifying actors had lanterns. And the lights in the house just slowly went down throughout the whole speech until you were listening to it, and everyone was just lit by these spinning lanterns that made it look like the whole theater was like full of fireflies. And she changed the second line, and she and I had a long conversation about it, and it's and as with Wiley Warren, her dramaturg who've had on the show before, it's like in the year of our Lord 2020, or when they did it 2019, and in a play that is all about the malleability and fluidity of gender and gender roles, this speech suggests gender binary like right there in the second line, and so she changed it. All the world's a stage, and all the people in it merely players. And she had gender non-conforming, gender fluid, and non-binary actors in her company for As You Like It. She had a non-binary actor play Audrey as Aubrey, and use they them pronouns. And so for me, like, this idea that the speech can simultaneously be a kind of like mournful and reflective, but also like very hopeful and truthful button on the story, as opposed to it just being something that Jacques says to the Duke and his friends in the middle of a scene that is otherwise sort of light and lifted, but that it also can be that it doesn't actually need to be prescriptive to gender. Those were 2 things that I really carried with me, and so even though I left the speech where it falls in my adaptation that we read together, I did change that second line. Because I like it so much more, and I think from henceforth I will always use that change, because for me it's a really lovely way of being so much more inclusive, and in such a simple way, inclusive of the potential truths that are in there, because I think this speech is very truthful. I don't get it though, and so that's what I mean when I say like it's inspired by Rosa. Like I don't know what to do with it. I hate it in the same way that I hate To Be or Not to Be, because it doesn't feel like it fits the play. The playwright in me is like, this doesn't fit your story. This is just a thing you wrote that you thought was good and you plugged it in. Almost like a song into a musical, right? Like it's almost like those jukebox musicals that they did with like Cole Porter, where it's like, that this song he did not write it for the story, but they plug it in anyway because it's a tune people know. That's kind of how I feel about it. So, yeah, I don't get it on some level. I feel like I'm missing the magic. Everyone talks about To Be or Not to Be in the same way, and I'm like, I don't get it. I don't get why people like it or why people care. So yeah, I have mixed and self-contradictory feelings about the speech.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny. I've heard this fun, interesting theory, and I don't know if there's a way to prove it, but I think it would be an interesting thing to at least explore, is that it was postulated once over drinks that perhaps speeches like this were meant as kind of an intermission break, go get a drink type of thing. So if you came back in the middle of it, you caught a lot of the themes that were in the play, but you were able to kind of just piece it together and keep moving forward, which I found to be funny. But I think the reason that if it stands out so much to people is because it doesn't quite fit in the moments that they happen in the play. You're talking about To Be or Not to Be, and you're talking about All the World's a Stage, and both of those soliloquies happen at a strange point in the flow and the progression of the piece. One earlier on, one later on, obviously. But I think that's why people remember it. That's why it's kind of worshipped, is because it's often taken as this isolated piece as opposed to recognized as its place within the piece itself. I agree that this speech, in terms of the progression of the plot, probably does belong somewhere else, but I think that one of the things a lot of people get caught up on is the individual ages themselves, as opposed to looking how the speech ends and how the speech starts. And I think that obviously for anybody who's read the speech or performed the speech, there's a cyclical element that is addressed in this entire speech. And we go through and we address all of these different archetypes of these characters that are being played by all of us at different points in our lives. And I think that this is the beauty of it. This is why a lot of people connect with it, is because, like you had both said, is that every single actor, performer, audience member can find one of these ages to connect to. But I think that's the trap of this piece. I think that's the trap of this soliloquy, is that we are looking to connect with an individual age as opposed to recognizing what all the ages together represent for the audience. And as I had spoken about earlier, perhaps what Shakespeare was trying to share with the audience using Jacques as a conduit. And we see this a lot with Shakespeare, and a lot of his more thoughtful characters is a quick address to how he thinks things could be or should be. And so we begin with all the world's a stage, and all the people in it merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, obviously having some allusions towards birth and death. And one person in their time plays many parts, 7 ages. And then we go through. We have the infant, we have the lover, we have the soldier, we have the justice, we have old age, and then we finally have second childishness again. And that is the part of the speech that I really do want to address, because it's so easy for us to, at different points in my life, I can certainly be like, oh yeah, like I've identified with the lover, and that's kind of what I connect with. So I play the lover during the start and the end of the speech. But the nihilism of Jacques has to come through. If we lose that nihilism throughout the piece, we can kind of lose the meaning of it. We slip back into second childishness, and everything starts to fade away slowly. We have spent so much time putting emphasis onto the archetypes that we play, the understanding of ourselves, the understanding of the world around us, based on these fine profiles that have been laid out. Are you a lover? Are you a soldier? Are you a whining schoolboy? Yeah. Are you Romeo? Are you Juliet? Are you Macbeth? Are you Antonio, whining schoolboy? Always think of Antonio for whining schoolboy. But really, at the end of it, and I think why this speech actually works quite well in this place, we were talking a lot about the ability to break away from expectations, the ability to break away from what maybe like an urban lifestyle or a royal noble lifestyle might suggest in terms of how you should behave, right? We see characters flourish into their own and really seize who they are. And this whole speech says, here are the 7 archetypes that we kind of profile ourselves as and classify ourselves as. But what does it mean at the end of it? At the end of all this entire life, each other's lives, the lives that we are getting to take a part in with each other, right? Nothing. Literally, It is absence of meaning. And so perhaps I think what is being explored here is that if we live our lives by archetypes, if we never take the chance to really understand ourselves and the people that are close to us or the world around us in more meaningful ways that are removed from these archetypes, we live a life of absent meaning. We lose everything by the end, including our own knowledge and awareness of the world around us. And I think that is why this speech actually works quite well in this play, is because it's a direct address to the expectations all these characters were once living versus the characters they decide to be throughout the course of the play. And some of them do still end up as the archetype that is listed here, but that's their choice. There's a difference in that. And in their own ways, they all come to acknowledge or appreciate each other's choices and who they want to be. And so, yeah, if we're talking about the importance and the significance of this speech, I think moving away from the understanding of the archetypes that are outlined within it, because as we've seen with Benedict Cumberbatch's performance for BBC, where they did that like wonderful video montage of it, the focus is very specifically on the 7 different ages, but not so much the absence of meaning. And we see this a lot. Actually, one of the few that I've seen do this really in terms of capturing the absence of meaning if we live by our lives is Richard Pascoe from RSC. During the Playing Shakespeare series that John Barton and RSC published back in the 70s, I believe. He does this wonderful, like it's probably the most nihilistic Jacques portrayal I've ever seen. But, when he hits that end and he talks about oblivion and the losing of the teeth, the eyes, the taste, and then eventually everything, it really hit that note for me where the speech just started to make sense. We can't conform to these archetypes. We can't force other people to conform to these archetypes. And if we do either of those two things, we are losing and destroying the meaning of our existence in the first place, which, as an absurdist philosopher study, is subjective. We create our own meaning. We have to. If there's no objective inherent meaning in life, so what do we do with that knowledge? We can either sit in the nihilism and the anguish of it, as characters like Hamlet and Jacques do, or we can find meaning in it, as maybe Orlando or Horatio does. And that's my 2 cents on that. Sorry for that.
Great. No, thank you. I mean, everything you say makes me think of the touch points that this has with kind of Buddhist notions of where, like in Buddhism, there's a conscientious meditation on death, and it is meant exactly to detach you from all of the roles that you put on,
Yeah.
right? And get you to confront the self that's underneath all of that. And I think much of what you say is pointing us in that direction. Yeah, I think it's lovely.
I also
And I would. Oh, go ahead, Claire, please.
okay. Well, I was just gonna say, what is curious to me then about this speech is that for all that it seems to reveal an innate nihilism in Jacques, he ends the play by saying, I'm going to seek out this religious man and try to find meaning with the Duke. So he doesn't end the play saying like, I'm going to go live monastically and just wait for the inevitable end because life is meaningless and there's no point. He says, I'm going to go seek out this religious figure who has transformed a tyrant like Duke Frederick, and I'm going to see if he has anything that he can tell me that will bring some sort of similar revelation or restitution to my soul. So it's like he's a nihilist, but unlike certain characters, there seems to be a flame inside of him that doesn't want to be. Like there's a part of him that actually doesn't want to be as cynical as he is, and that's what makes him so fascinating to me. I think that characters who are just cynics are so boring, but I think that characters who are cynical because it's covering up or it is a way of coping with something else, those characters are so interesting. I'm writing an adaptation of a stage adaptation of A Tale of Two Cities right now, and the absolute best thing about the character of Sidney Carton is that he isn't actually a cynic. He presents as one, but it is absolutely a coping mechanism, and so that is something I can sink my teeth into. And I think this is often because we have so many male characters and male creators who think that like cynicism for its own sake is inherently interesting, and I would argue that it's really not. But cynicism that is a mask, cynicism that is a way of guarding or protecting, or something that is actually characters are trying to shake off, like they don't want to think that life is meaningless, but they have been so hurt and wounded by life that now they kind of do, and are looking for a way out, which is how we approached Mirabelle with Way of the World. The world had made him into a cynic, and he desperately didn't want to be anymore. So those characters are fascinating to me, and I think that Jacques' choice in the end to go join Duke Frederick and the religious man shows that like whatever his nihilism, like it isn't all there is, or at least he doesn't want it to be all there is, and that's what really connects me to the character.
Yeah. And I find it so much of what you've just said to be absolutely fascinating, because I completely agree. Like cynicism for the sake of being cynical, like doesn't play well at all. Like, it needs to come from a place. And I mean, one thing I do find very interesting about the speech as well is how well it captures something that is explored in psychology of trauma, which is kind of like the separation of different chunks of our lives is kind of a different story altogether, and the recreation of oneself entering a new age of your life. You know, you enter high school and you create a new version of yourself. You enter college or university, you enter a new age of yourself. You graduate from college or university, you're the next age of yourself. Yeah. But it's one coherent storyline. You are still the same person you were back then. You've just grown and developed since then. But by separating your life into these separate stories, and sometimes people even view them as not even part of the same series of stories, we actually limit our understanding and our awareness of ourselves. Yeah. And I think that's a danger. And I do find I agree completely. Like I don't see Jacques' ending as this like sad or tragic thing where he's kind of like separated and alone from all the characters, because he goes seeking out his meaning, like his purpose. Yeah. And I think there's a lot of power in that. Yeah. And we actually see, and I sorry to keep bringing up Hamlet, but the comparison is so palpable, is that like we actually see Hamlet do the same thing. He's caught in this intellectual thought world of heightened philosophy, and eventually like decides in a thoughtly world. But he actively decides, I'm done thinking. Now is the time for action. Yeah. And he follows through. And I think Jacques takes the same choice, but he is in a comedy, so it ends very differently for him. But yeah, so I think it's a wonderful exploration. But yeah, for anybody who is ever working on these types of characters who are cynical, jaded, you really have to ask yourselves why, and find some of the depth of that character. And I actually agree with you a lot, Jeremy, is like you talked about the potential of Jacques being representative of queer communities, and I think that is a absolutely phenomenal representation that this character can take on, especially if you're staging it in a very classical lens in terms of a traditional staging. I think there's a lot of power that can be brought in through the character through that. And again, that kind of archetypal profiling that can exist in those dynamics throughout the play. And why he's a little bit more flustered and frustrated with the other characters that are like Orlando, just very hard on the sleeve, not really care about the opinions.
I also think, and this may be both reductive and controversial, but I also think he is written as a clown. It's a different clown. It's more like Festy than Touchstone, right? But part of the point is for him to sort of like piss on everybody else's parade, and to sort of do to be the down energy up and to and including the point where he basically stops the party at the end, to draw attention back to himself and sort of give an FU to the audience, right?
Yeah.
Or to the audience and to the audience there on stage, the other characters.
Yeah.
And that's part of the point and the drive, I think, behind him too, is that he's there as a foil and a fool to sort of push us in the other direction and to keep us from, to give us some medicine with the sugar, as Mary Poppins might say.
Love that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's really no Shakespeare play that wouldn't be improved if Mary Poppins flew in.
The other thing, while we're still on Jake's for a bit, and the touch points between Jake's, Touchstone, and Rosalind, and Orlando to another degree, and Sylvia's, is that all of these characters are collecting something. They're collecting beauty, they're collecting short stories, they're collecting bits of poetry, they're collecting experiences, and Jake's is like the collector who I would argue is actually collecting them maybe in a book, and like I'm paging through and I encountered the All the World's a Stage speech somewhere and it seems appropriate for this, so I'm just going to read it to you like out of a hymnal. And there is something where the quality of As You Like It as a whole, and certainly the quality of Jake's as maybe its chief emblem in a lot of ways, is that collection. It's like a chapbook of unrelated things, unrelated characters, unconnected stories, roles that we put on, and like it's this pastiche or quilt that is sort of sewn together, and it's odd the way it's put together, but it works. Yeah.
And to touch on that, maybe my last point about this speech in particular, there's just so much to unpack in it, whether you're looking at it as an isolated piece or part of the play as a whole. I do find it interesting that most of the ages are captured as and then, but the two ages that aren't is at first the infant, an almost unconscious state of being and just existence, right? And then obviously the sixth stage shifts. And so we refer to these two ages, and I think there's something really powerful to explore in the sixth age. And if we were to take your direction on this, as Jacques is leafing through a book and he finds this passage he feels is appropriate for this, is very much finding like the comedic tempo and pacing of it. But in the sixth age, that's where his shift actually happens, his awareness of the situation, the tragedy of what's taking place now and what can be prevented. Because they talk of, Shakespeare speaks of, this shift into old age. But then this line here is always something that catches me, because the initial reading of it is obviously like, oh, there's a double entendre here. It's very funny. His youthful hose well saved, a world too wide for his shrunk shank. Right. But the power of this is also referring obviously to like pants and how they have over time worn down, and you've been saving them for this like special occasion, but the special occasions have never risen. So you've kept waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting. And kind of the relation that can also take to personality and identity. You keep waiting, you keep preserving, you keep waiting for the right moment, the right people, the right place, the right time. But in all of that time of like restricting yourself from your identity and who you choose to be and want to be, you deteriorate over time. And suddenly there's less value and special uniqueness of you in that. And it's unfortunate that for a lot of people and for a lot of characters in the canon, that this awareness doesn't come until old age. I mean, look at Lear as well, as another character who realizes in his old age, approaching second childishness, that is that transition of that character, is that awareness of his faults, the archetype he put himself into versus who he could have been for his daughters and for his people, right? And I think there's such power to explore within that last chunk of this piece, is the shift of profiling ourselves into archetypes and others into archetypes, and then the awareness of how wrong and incorrect that is for our own existence and lives.
Yeah, and also just the very basic rule of don't procrastinate because your time is limited. That life is actually ultimately ephemeral. I mean, for God's sake, someone dive into Hamlet and tell Hamlet this speech and just, like, help the boy out. But I do think that what you're pointing to, Will, is that actually is thematically resonant to me because it stands directly in contradiction to Rosalind, who does not wait. She does not procrastinate. She just jumps in. Guns blazing, chin high, like wordplay at the ready. She just like, she jumps into life once she is Ganymede. She jumps into the middle of the action, often literally. And she just like hurls herself into the middle of the world and into the middle of relationships, and she just does things. And yes, we can call her reckless or, impetuous or impatient. We can absolutely unpack the cruelty that she, flings at Phoebe. But like, she is on some level, she is active in a way that so few characters and so few people are. And Rosalind was such an important character for me growing up. It was like her and Emma Woodhouse were like the two heroines that I like needed in my life when I was 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, because I was always called bossy and I was always called impatient and I was always, like culturally, both from my peers and from people that were older than me, like I was always told, like, step back, sit down, shut up, like, this is not your place, we don't want to hear from you. And Emma and Roz are both such, like, they're directors. I think they're both like theater directors. They both have that instinct in them to micromanage and to get their hands messy and to like jump into the middle of the action and do everything and sense everything and be the generator of decisions and choices. And to push things forward to whatever conclusion they desire. And so when Rosalind and Jacques ultimately meet in this play, it's so funny because you can tell from their conversation that he wants so desperately to be cynical about her. He wants to be able to just write her off the way he has written off Orlando, and he can't because she's so freaking smart. She's so smart and she's so quick, and he's like, oh, you're sort of great. You're kind of awesome. Your boyfriend's pretty stupid, but you're kind of great. And I think it's because on some level he recognizes that she represents the sheer majesty of not waiting for life and not like holding out, but just embracing the moment and living in the moment and doing when you can. Mm-hmm.
And I think like you had said, is that Rosalind representing the antithesis of the speech of taking action in the moment and define yourself and your own role in it. Jacques is left at the end of the play without a sense of firm meaning or identity and doesn't quite he never make clear what he wants, and he doesn't get what he wants because he doesn't know what he wants, right? Yeah. Otherwise, though, these other characters who have learned to create their own identity, create their own goals, create their own meaning, create their own pursuits, right? They all get what they want by the end of the play. And this is not an uncommon thing in the canon. The characters who decide what they want often end up getting what they want. Whether that's for a tragic spin or a comedic spin, it does turn out in their favor if they live truly by their wants, right? And their identity. And I think it really does say something that Jacques doesn't. And kind of the capturing of the speech. I think that's why he's so infatuated with Rosalind, because he sees this incredibly intelligent, creative, witty person who knows what she wants and goes for it and doesn't really caution to the wind, and he doesn't get that, and it's so removed from his own world and his own understanding of it, and yet it's working for her. Mm-hmm. And then also with Orlando, he gets so flustered and frustrated with him, like calling him basically like lover boy, like get your head down from the clouds type of energy and teasing. And like he's interacting with all these different characters, Touchstone as well, like absolutely fascinated with Touchstone, right? All characters who speak what they want to speak, say what they want to say, and do what they want to do, and they're getting what they want. And Jacques struggle with that. And I think that this speech occurs earlier in the play, maybe for that reason. It's an awareness and a progression of his own character and understanding of what he's doing wrong. And maybe there's a lot of character study to do in that in terms of his final decision to leave and go elsewhere.
Yeah. Maybe he's taking a leaf out of Rosalind's book. He's like, well, she just decided that she wanted this and she went after it. Maybe I'll try the same.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Powerful message.
Yeah, they have an interesting conversation. It's the only time they really talk to each other, where they're touching sort of on that notion, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where they're talking about what experiences have they tried.
Yeah.
And the note from Rosalind to Jacques is, you have a lot of experience, but you it's sort of a shame that that's all you have. You don't have, the phrase is escaping me, but the implication is you don't have an actual thing. You don't have a relationship. You don't have any
rich eyes and poor hands.
Right. So you don't have any money, which is the real take on that, right? All you have is this sort of like collection of things. You don't have anything real, and that's the note there that I think speaks to some of what you're saying.
Yeah.
In any case, that's all I really have to say about the speech and Jacques as a whole. This little tidbit, this very small little bit that I had to say. Thank you so much for listening to me ramble.
No, I'm so glad you did, because God knows I couldn't. I don't have enough to say about him. So no, thank you so much for unpacking it and for sort of going into such detail about it. That's just marvelous. And I think if you really can't talk about this play, certainly not in a deep dive format, without diving into one of that, that famous speech, one of the most famous he ever wrote. As curveballish as it can feel in the course of the play, I think that you bring up a lot of points, Will, about how it could be integrated, or how the ideas and themes of it can actually be woven into the of the action. And I really like the idea that on some level Rosalind inspires him. I think if I ever directed it, that would be a thread that I would like to tug on, because it seems true to her, who she is and what she represents in the world of the play. And it also is very hopeful to me that a character who is so self-isolated, if not literally, then like mentally he's self-isolated, that he can be inspired and emboldened to chase what he wants, even if he doesn't quite know what it is, by a young woman who does that. I don't know. I like that. Mm-hmm. I like that as an interpretation for the two of them, especially if Jacques is being played by a male presenting actor. There's something really lovely about that notion.
And I think it's as simple as just Jacques having a sincere goodbye to specifically Rosalind as he's doing his exit off the stage, speaking of where he's going to go. And like, just, yes, everyone else is around. Yes, he's had dynamics with all these other characters, but by specifically going and saying goodbye to Rosalind, I think in that you could really capture that energy and that essence you're speaking of.
That would be really lovely. And that is actually, again, like I've talked on this show before, I have a very few number of dream roles, because I just do not rate my acting abilities that highly. I'm very, very introvert. I'm very scared of being an actor. But she is one of mine, because I love how fast her mind works. And it's one of those things that I just like really connect to, is that she's like a unstoppable faucet of words, often to her own detriment. But she just, like, her brain just goes a million miles an hour, and that really speaks to me. And I would love to explore the delight that she and Jacques can take in each other, because I think he also has a mind that works a million miles an hour. I don't think he talks as fast as she does. I think she is like she's just like, I don't know, what's a really, really fast moving bird? Like, what birds go really, really fast?
A hummingbird.
Hummingbird. She's like a hummingbird. And I don't think that he is a hummingbird. However, I do think that his synapses are firing at the rate that hers are. So when they finally meet each other, it's like, oh, this is fun. We may disagree, but we can do this all day. Mm-hmm. And he does. He says goodbye to all of the couples when he's leaving, and it would be so lovely if he went over to her specifically, and that maybe he talks to the other people, but that there is something physical that happens between the two of them, to represent their authentic goodbye. Damn it, Will, we got to do this play.
I want to so bad. Like I said, it's a dream of mine to direct it or at least play Jacques. Just talking about the temperament of the two characters, like one being very fast, one being very slow, it reminds me so much of Stanislavski's second book, Building Character. There's a passage in there where Stanislavski and his cohort of actors that are understudy enter the studio space, and there's like 100 metronomes all ticking at different tempos.
Yeah.
And so you just get this chaotic whirlwind of ticking sounds all around you, right? And the director of the space says to move, find a metronome and move in that tempo, move in that rhythm, right? And so all the actors begin moving, and then there's this one moment of harmony. And for anybody who's heard multiple metronomes going at once, there's a moment where just for a few seconds everything ticks together. And I think that in that moment that you're talking about, like Rosalind and Jacques coming together, the first moment they meet is like tick, 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 and then tick, tick, but they're contrasting each other. But then that final sincere moment is final harmonic ticking together before he finally says goodbye. And I think that there's so much power that could be captured in that.
I love that. Yeah. It's a fun, special, quirky little play. I'm a fan.
Me too.
Yeah. That's all I have. Unless you guys want to bring up anything. Is there anything we didn't talk about that you want to make sure we touch on?
I think we poked enough holes in this speech.
Yeah, I'm happy to leave it off here, but this has been a fantastic discussion.
Yeah, I just have to say I love this play. It's a problematic mess, and that's what all the best plays are. Yeah. And so I love it. I could direct it every day until I die, and I don't think I would unpack it fully.
That's how I feel about LLL. Could do it for the rest of my life.
I don't know about The Tempest too, but hooray.
Hooray. Well, Will, thank you so much for joining us today. It was so great to have you on.
Well, thank you for having me. It's always a privilege, and I certainly learned a lot speaking with both of you, and it was excellent meeting you for the first time, Jeremy.
Nice to meet you. What a thrill.
Everyone listening, thanks for joining us. We will see you next time.